So thank you so much, Dave and Nora, for coming to Helsinki and for being here with us today. Very briefly, we have a group here of people interested in change. And we all know, slightly on a generic level, that we face complex challenges and we live in complex context. But could you open up to us a bit? What is complexity? How does complexity relate to complicated? And how should we think of this? Dave, go ahead.
Okay, I've been delegated. Okay, there's a very simple way. First of all, it's important to realize that complexity is a science. It's not a way of thinking. And it's also important to realize that complexity is not a subset of systems thinking. It has different origins, different backgrounds, and limited intersections. Yeah? The best way I've learned to understand it two ways. One is to look at the origin of the word complicated and complex. So complicated comes from a Latin root word, which means to be folded. And something which can be folded can be unfolded, it doesn't change. Whereas complex comes from a Greek root word, which means to be entangled. And something which is entangled cannot be unentangled and tangled the same way, which means any system which is complex has a high degree of path dependency. What has come before influences what is and what is next. So that's one factor. The other factor, I think, is in a complex systems approach to change. You don't focus on individual change. That's really bad science. You can't change a system by changing the individuals in the system. There are simply too many of them, and it's too big a task. But you can change the way in which they interact. And some of the work we're doing on peace and reconciliation at the moment, which I'm moving on to in Berlin next week and Washington the week after by way of Oxford, is to bring young people together from opposite sides of the political spectrum to work in very small groups on problems which they agree they have in common and not talk about their differences. Because there are some fundamental principles to managing complex systems. One is the principle of obliquity. In fact, there's a really good book written with that title. And anybody with teenage children knows this already. You don't tackle complex problems directly, you tackle them indirectly. And that also links in with another key concept, is people have to have the right to interpret their own experience and find their own solutions. It is not the role of middle-class, comfortable change agents to tell them how they should be. And there's far too much of that. Yeah? So it's called epistemic justice in the literature. It's giving people the right to work out solutions for themselves in their own time. And we first did this in Northern Ireland in the 70s. Instead of bringing people into a big hall and getting everybody to talk about how they should really like each other, facilitators love that sort of thing because they feel good about themselves afterwards, but it makes bugger all difference. We took small groups of Catholics and Protestants and dumped them in the slums of Rio de Janeiro for 6 months, and we didn't talk about their differences. And they found out pretty fast that they had more in common than they realized, and they had a conversation about their differences when they were ready to have it in their own language at their own time without facilitation. And probably the most important thing about a complex system change is you have to change the dispositions of the system so that good things are more likely to happen, rather than trying to decide how the system should be. Yeah, you change the ecosystem in which you're working rather than deciding what the output is. And that, by the way, was the major error of systems thinking. It thought you could define everything as an engineering model, and remember, it all came from engineering, with the honorable exception of your father. Yeah, and it was kind of like we set the objectives, we close the gap. Yeah, complexity takes another approach, and the easiest way to remember this, and I'll finish with this point, we called it the Frozen 2 strategy. So has everybody seen Frozen 2 yet? Right, it is a great complexity movie. You don't need children or grandchildren to watch it. Professor Snowden said you should watch it, all right? That's your excuse. In the middle of that movie, the real heroine of the Frozen series, who's the younger sister without the magic, yeah, sings a beautiful song, subsequently made famous by a Ukrainian refugee. All I can do is do the next right thing. All right? And that in complexity is called the adjacent possible, going back to Stuart Kaufman. So all I can do in the face of uncertainty is understand where the hell I am, stop talking about the future, talk about where you are, and identify where people can go next, encourage them to go there, and then look again.
Yep, I agree.
Oh, come on.
That was easy. I think, you know, for me, I grew up in a household where my father, Gregory Bateson, was one of the people who actually helped to bring cybernetics, and then that became systems theory related to complexity theory into the world. And there was a major difference, though. Imagine my surprise when, after growing up in a household in which this idea of a system was not something that was organized and engineered and diagrammable. A system was something juicy. It was something messy. It was something alive. And that juiciness, that messiness, I think, is what's really important. So, you know, when you think about do the next right thing, do the next thing that's the best thing to do, allowing people to be in communication and not making direct correctives. In these cases, what we're looking at is something that's a little bit untamed. That there is a way in which people can be in communication that is not directed, that allows for the next best thing to happen. There's a way in which, when we're working with complex systems, they will actually, with a shift in disposition, the shift will come. But this is a very different way of coming at, a very different approach than to think about, here's what we want, the change we want to see, and now let's make it happen. That approach gets you in trouble. So I guess, I mean, I'm just coming from a session in Singapore where we had a group of people who were from, you know, all the big wars right now, from Russia and Ukraine, from Islamic communities and Jewish communities. And we did not talk about that thing. We talked about a whole lot of other aspects of life and let them find each other. And when they start to find each other, they make relationship. And when they make relationship, then they can make all sorts of things happen. The mistake is to start right in the middle of the conflict and try to fix it from there. Complicated. So sometimes, you know, people talk about complicated is like a rocket ship and complex is raising children. Something like that.
Yeah, Paul Killier said it's an aeroplane in a mayonnaise.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There you
same
go.
principle.
You both talk about perceiving complexity. What do you mean?
Okay, so I'm a materialist, right? I mean, there's a whole philosophical movement called new materialism, which is worth people looking into, right? Because it also recognizes that narrative structures in human systems actually have material reality. And if you don't know it, we now know from epigenetics that culture inherits. We know the biological mechanisms by which culture inherits, and narrative plays an important key point in that. So we're very much entrained by the patterns of the narrative in the society and the groups we grow up in, and those narratives have material reality. So I think it's really important to realize that reality exists and you've got to live with it. Yeah, and we always talk about there's ontology, how things are, there's epistemology, how we know things, and there's phenomenology, how we perceive things. And you need to keep them rubbing against each other constantly, because they can never be perfectly aligned. But you've got to recognize that reality is part of the equation. That's why we take a natural science approach. So to take an illustration, let's come back to the individual. Human beings are defined by their interactions. About 5 or 10% of your decisions are made by your brain. Most are made by your body or by your social environment. It's why most of us dislike phrases like mental models or mindsets, because they're really bad concepts. Yeah, they're framing human beings in the context of computers, and that's where that language comes from. Right? So if you want to change human beings, you've got to change that social context in which they operate, yeah, in order for things to change. And that's also ethical. It's not ethical to try and change somebody's mindset. It's perfectly ethical to change their interactions. And I think the ethics of this are as important as we move on to that. And picking up a point from Nora, we talk about messy coherence. And coherence is a really important word in philosophy of science at the moment, because it basically says that we know that evolutionary theory, for example, is probably wrong. But what we now have in the theory is coherent to the facts as we know them. So, if you go back 20 years, epigenetics wasn't known, now we now know it, everything changes. On contrast with that, young Earth creationism is incoherent. There's no point in pursuing that pathway, it's just ridiculous. Although it's quite scary, if you don't know it, 2/3 of the chief knowledge officers of American government departments are young Earth creationists. I find that really, really depressing, if you look at their title, right? So one of the key things, and I think this is a key thing for change agents, there's a tendency in change people to say everybody's views are equally valid. Well, sorry, they're not. Yeah, some views are reprehensible, and some views are actually based on really bad science. So eliminating incoherent pathways is actually quite important because it allows us to focus. And the fancy academic word for messy coherence is coherent heterogeneity. And I'll make this point because it's a really important point. I'm Welsh, all right? I'll just do a sidebar, you can come back to this later. I first got into complexity when I was doing an ontological synthesis of Catholicism, Hinduism, and Marxism, which got me summarized for heresy. So there are some interesting paths in this background, all right? But retrospective coherence, the other thing about being Welsh is rugby is a religious matter. It's not a sport, it's a religious matter. And I'm in a depressed state at the moment, all right? 8 losing bonus points is not where I expected to be at this stage of the season. And I support Cardiff Rugby, we play at the Arms Park, we play in blue and black. We're very civilised rugby players, yeah? If we get a yellow card, it's because the other side bribed the referee. We never cheat. Yeah, we're very civilised spectators. We cheer the other side if they do well. It's a civilised place to go, Cardiff. It's the capital city. Then there are those bastards down the road in Llanelli. We call them Turks because in the 19th century they hijacked a Turkish ship and we never, ever will let them forget it. Yeah, they definitely bribe referees. It's the only reason why we got that red card last time we played them. They're filthy and the spectators are partisan. But when the English arrive, we're Welsh. Now that's called coherent heterogeneity. It's something change agents need to understand because they tend to homogenize. Let's get everybody together with people who think like us and reinforce our belief systems. Homogeneous systems do not evolve. Heterogeneous systems do. So it's the ability to be different in some contexts and the same in other contexts, which is a key skill to develop.
I think with my work, where I'm working with perception of complexity is, first of all, recognizing that there are deep and old habits that are informed by mechanistic success and industrialized epistemological familiar language usage, ways of thinking about how you get a thing done, ways of thinking about how a family is structured, and looking at how these models of industrialism have actually, and I'm going to use this word, infected our health system, our education system, our understanding of things like statistics, the way that we think about psychology. I mean, all these things have roots that go way back into a notion that ties into what we were talking about just a moment ago of fixing the parts. And looking at if you could just fix the parts, you would get a better whole. And so I guess the perception of complexity is that way in which I might look at you, or I might look at a forest, and instead of saying, oh, look at that tree, or oh, look at that person, I'm actually able to begin to perceive that that tree is not just a tree. That tree is the culmination and the ongoing entangling of the living processes of hundreds of thousands of organisms, as are you. And so if I can perceive in any small way the people, the families, the communities, the societies around me, not as entities in and of themselves that are closed, but recognizing all the relationships that it's taken for this system to become the way it is becoming, that then when I am in relationship to it, when I'm in communication with you or a tree or a family, that communication will come from a different place. It will be guided from a different approach. So for me, that's really important. I developed this concept of symathesy, which is a word that no one can say. But the sim means together and the mathesy means learning, and this idea that we're in this learning together. So that when you come to a crooked tree in the woods, instead of saying, that tree is crooked, let's fix it. What do we need to do to fix that tree? That instead you might ask, how is that tree learning to be in its world? And if you ask that question, you start to look in a different way, right? Then that crooked tree, you can see that crooked tree is reaching into the light over here because there's shadows over here, or that the tree is leaning this way because there's a wind, or that there are insects over here, or that there are, more nutrients in the soil on this side. And when you look at a living system in the way that is forming and informing into its world, with that sort of a question, the way that you can respond to it is totally different. If I come in saying, what's wrong with this kid? We need to fix this kid. What's wrong with this family? That approach is going to lead me to a whole list of direct correctives that do not shift the interactions. Okay, so that's the thing. If you can perceive the complexity, then the way you come in will be in that question more of how do we allow these interactions to shift.
It's interesting. It's one of the dirty old habits, which, if I want to get technical, are called assemblages, all right? But dirty old habits is a much better name. Is actually what's called fundamental attribution error. Is we assume there is a reason for everything, and there isn't. In a complex system, there is no material linear causality. So you have to recognize that the dispositional state influences the way things develop. And there are three really interesting models we're currently looking at from nature. One is looking at the way that fungal roots connect tree roots. And it's a symbiotic relationship. The fungal roots are rhizomic, they're entangled, the tree roots go in straight lines in effect. Now what's interesting is the fungal roots will redistribute resources to younger trees in a drought condition in a forest. Now, if you look in organizations, informal networks do the same sort of thing. So having recognized this, a large part of our work is to create dense informal networks in order to connect people across silos. You don't force people to connect, you create informal networks. The other one, there's a lovely exercise you can do, which is tell everybody in a room, you need a bigger room than this with a flat floor. Get everybody to identify their worst enemy and their best friend. Before you do this, say don't look at anybody or say anything. And tell them they can choose people at random, but they never do, so video it and study it afterwards. It can teach you a lot, right? and then tell everybody to protect, to actually make sure their best friend is between them and their enemy. And the group dissipates over the room within seconds. Change the rule so that they have to protect their best friend from their enemy, and the group clumps in the second. Right, that comes from antelope behavior. So what happens with antelope, if they see a predator, each antelope identifies another antelope and places themselves between that antelope and the predator. And that's what keeps the herd together. A really simple heuristic. But that actually means the system can align and go into new territory without having to have a purpose, a North Star, or a direction. And one of the big switches we're working on at the moment is switching from purpose to alignment. Yeah, because alignment gives you adaptability. And the other really interesting one is the waggle dance of bees. Now, this is a famous example. So if bees are seeking a new, the drones get fed up with the old queen, they hatch out a new queen, they end up with a swarm hanging from a branch. Individual bees go out and try and find a good place to stay, and then they come back and they dance on the swarm. They literally do a figure of 8 dance, which indicates where the new hive should be. And there are bees which actually deliberately disrupt some of the dances. The negative disruption is key to the system. And after a short period of time, the entire hive, the entire swarm goes to a location. If anybody wants the research on this, it's fascinating. They always go to the best location they could have found. Yeah, because you've got multiple micro-interactions. Now, we're now looking at that in decision-making. Because if you can move into large-based network solutions, you can create novelty in a way that you can't create with individual direction. So again, it comes back to something both Nora and I have said, both on this occasion and before. It's all about networked intelligence. It's all about diversity. And I mean, there's some other things we could go into, but it's fundamentally, it's about interactions at scale. Right? And if we're going to solve the problems we face in the world at the moment, we've got to do things at scale, not in small groups of people. And that's something which change makers, if I'm honest, are not really focused on. And we've got to find ways to get that focus rearranged.
I'm thinking also about where that perception sits. So one of the stories that I use in my warm data courses is the story of the moose and the rattlesnake. And I'm a California kid. I grew up running up and down the mountains of Northern California. And if you live like that, you have to learn to see a rattlesnake because there's rattlesnakes on the path. And so when I was very young, I learned to spot rattlesnakes. And if you and I went for a walk in the woods and we came to a rattlesnake, I would probably see it. And
I wouldn't, and I can tell you that from personal experience. Right?
So they camouflage, the diamonds on their back may look very symmetrical when you see the rattlesnake in the zoo, but when it's actually on the path, it mimics the way the light comes in and the formation of the particular rocks that are in California and so on. So you probably wouldn't see it. Now, not seeing a rattlesnake can be a problem because they sunbathe right across a path. Okay. If you step on it, you could get bitten. Now, that's nice. But when I moved to Sweden, that piece of wisdom and knowledge didn't do me much good. Because in Sweden, there's no rattlesnakes, but there are moose. And you would think that I would be able to see a moose. It's a big thing. But I can't see the moose. And my husband's like, Nora, there's a moose, watch out, don't hit the moose. And I'm like, what moose, what moose, what moose? That moose, he says, which fortunately I didn't hit. So what's happening there? Well, one of the things that's happening there is that it's not actually the rattlesnake that I'm seeing. What I'm actually perceiving is the differences and the nuances in the California forest. I know those differences. But because I haven't been in Sweden so very long, when the moose stands at the edge of the forest, I can't actually figure out the difference between its horns and the forest because I don't know the forest. The key thing here, the word that I want you to notice, is difference. So I'm not perceiving those relational properties, characteristics that would highlight that difference that is the moose. You see, it's the conditions
Because
again.
I think this is probably one of the most important points. So human beings evolved to only engage active cognitive thought if there's an anomaly. Right? This is Clark's work and Seth's work and other people. So fundamentally, the way we make decisions is we're constantly creating micro-hallucinations, and they are hallucinations. Right? From our own experience, the experience of others that we hear through stories, and from a pure imagination. Yeah, we're actually really good at this. This is the abductive stuff that you and I both work on. And those are constantly interacting with signals. Now, it is not a linear process. We're not an intelligent camera. This is non-linear. And as those signals interact with the hallucinations, stable patterns form, and we go with the stable pattern. That's how we make decisions. We're not rational beings. You can't just, this nonsense idea that if you just educated people properly and gave them the right information, they would make the right decisions, is one of the most dangerous illusions that change makers have. Right? It's not the way we make decisions. If you want people to change, you've got to create anomalies. You know, if you're walking down the street, and I came out of the hotel this morning, I started to walk down the street, I wasn't paying attention, I fell over, I had to go back into the hotel and change, I then paid a lot of attention to walking. So when you get an anomaly, you think differently. Mm-hmm. And the key thing, if you want, you've got to create these contrasts. So for example, one of the things we do is we'll gather stories from a very large population. Remember I talked about scale? And then we'll show people how different groups of people interpreted the same story. At no stage are we saying you should think like this. We're saying, well, you saw it like this and you saw it like that. What do you think it means? What you're doing is you're creating anomalies across boundaries, which people have to take account of. Yeah, they can't just dismiss it. Yeah? So I think that the concept of anomaly or differences, that's really important to the way human beings make decisions, particularly if you want them to change. Most of the time, we're really conservative. You know, whatever is working, we just go with. We don't bother checking it.
It's really important to the way we think about information. And I think when we look at these kind of slight differences or even larger comparisons or contrasts, say, between the moose's horns and the tree line, those differences are relational. That is relational information. Just as the rattlesnakes, the difference between the way the rattlesnakes camouflage, it's ever so slight. But in that difference is a relationship between the snake and the stones, between the moose and the forest. So what we're talking about when we're talking about perception of complexity, I think, is actually, we're looking at relational information. And this is not the kind of information we've been trained to seek out. We've been trained to seek out information in bits and blobs. And bits and blobs are nice, but they're better when they're next to each other. And you can start to, when you're talking about the stories that are not the same, it's one thing to say, this group of people had this story and this group of people had that story. And if you happen to be a participant looking at both of those, what are you thinking? Well, you're thinking, there's possibility for a lot of stories here, which is actually the message, isn't it? Right? It's not that these guys are right and these guys are wrong. It's the possibility of recognizing, there's a multiplicity of
and again, I think,
stories.
Yeah, it's really important. This is a sort of messiness that we're talking about. One of the really strong tendencies in Western thinking, and this goes back to before Augustine, is Manichaean thinking. Yeah, it's the creation of dichotomies. There is this thing which is good, there is this thing which is bad. Yeah, and it's a very dominant thinking. And the famous thing we say in theology is that Paul took the worst of Christ, Augustine took the worst of Paul, and Calvin took the worst of Augustine, right? Sorry, if you're into theology, you'll understand that, right? But fundamentally, the danger is we like to say there are good things and there are bad things. Yeah? Yeah, that's master and emissary, which we've disagreed on before, right? I don't buy that concept because the world is far more fragmented and far more interconnected than talking about two things in contrast with each other will ever explain. But it's a really strong tendency in Western thinking that we need to avoid. And you can see this in change agents. We're together. We know that we need to change the planet. We know ecology is a disaster. Why won't those idiots listen to us? Let's just tell them it harder. Well, sorry, that isn't going to work. You're not going to get people to actually make the dispositional change which will allow politicians to make the long-term decisions they've got to make for the planet until they see local threat and local issues. That's one of the areas we're working on at the moment. How can we create stories about small local things that make people aware of climate change? Because if we get that to a critical mass, that will change the state, and politicians can then make the bigger decision. Yeah, and that's a different approach to change. Change the environment so that good things are more likely to happen. Stop trying to decide what the good things are in advance.
Wonderful, thank you.
Hold on.
Yes.
I just want to go back to this for a second because I think it's really important. It came up this morning in our Warm Data Lab. But one of the reasons that I think we're all in this room here today is that there is a really high degree of polarization and divisiveness that has infiltrated into our communities. It's infiltrated into our families, even at this point. And one of the ways that you generate polarization and divisiveness is by removing context, by removing the complexity. So this when we're talking about getting people together to tell stories that aren't the stories of the thing they're in conflict on, what we're actually doing is generating complexity. And this is, it may not seem like it, but when you tell a story from your life, when you look at any moment in your life, what you're going to be doing is bringing a lot of things in. Any story is going to be your economics, your culture, your family, your history, your technology, your politics. I mean, any story. How you got here today includes all of that stuff. So when people are in storytelling modalities, they are in complexity. They are speaking into the ecology, the livingness, which is something completely different than when you take that away and they begin to fight about abstractions.
Actually, we're Homo narrans, Homo ludens, and narrans, ludens, and Faber. Not Homo sapiens.
Right.
Yeah, we're tool makers, we're jokers, we're storytellers. And if you start to think about those three, we need to create tools which allow people to bring themselves together in ways that they find coherent. We need more humor in society than we got at the moment. Life has become deadly serious, and that goes with Manichaean thinking. Yeah, and above all, we need to understand these micro stories because they're the fundamental patterning of human sense-making.
And they are the complexity.
Yeah.
That's the thing that I think we can lose. Because you could think, oh, wow, we're going to, in order to get this complexity, what we need is a super big spreadsheet.
Oh, Jesus.
Right? And if you have a super big spreadsheet, if I could just get all the data in there, then I could make the proper computations. Wrong. Because that's just it. That's not where it lives. Okay, this idea that if you get lots and lots of information that you're going to get the complexity does not take into account that it's not in the data, it's in the relationship between them. Your story is going to hold only relational information.
Thank you so much. Do we have time for questions? Yes. Then we can open up for a few questions. There is one straight away. Please, when the microphone is coming. Thank you so much, Dave and Nora. And
Are we done already?
no, we
we've
have
got
a few minutes
we're
for
in the
questions.
normal microphone handing out lag.
Sorry to.
Hi, thanks for really fascinating talk. I was just wondering, actually so many questions, so I'm going to try and combine two into a single question. The idea of adjacent possible and sort of doing the next right thing. And I was just wondering that in the context where, and maybe possible solution to this apparent conflict, in a context where we take it as a given that one cares about the holistic wellness of a given system, how do we avoid certain kind of dysfunctions like over-optimizing locally and multipolar traps? Does it require that those who are taking these next actions are somehow aware of the holistic picture, or how do we bridge that gap so that local interactions don't lead to wider dysfunction?
Want to go first or shall I?
You could go first.
Okay. First of all, I would ban the word holistic. It is a really dangerous word. If you look at the preconditions for emergence, you require lots of what are called actants, which are agents in the system. You need rich interactions, and none of the agents must have knowledge of the whole. The minute you start to say, I understand the whole, or we need to think holistically, you actually are making a major mistake because you can't. And then you start to assert power about that worldview you have, and you don't tolerate views which actually contradict it. So I'm dubious about the holistic word. Yeah? If you want to look at some of the work we're doing there, we're currently working with distributed resource allocation. So if you look in the theoretical biology, it's also Dunbar, but theoretical biology is a better base. There's a natural group of 5 people, which is a number of active decision makers as an extended family. So in groups of 5 or less, we'll compromise. Once you go above 5, we fall into our tribes. So we're now working in the development sector on how do you allocate $500, $100 amounts. Because you know that will make a big difference and you can afford more failure. Whereas actually the big banks can only allocate 50 million. Now, I'd spent a lot of time with Mohammed Yunus on this in the development. This is Grameen Bank stage 3. Right? What we're now saying is if you can assemble 4 roles, which, for example, one of the ones we're working on is village priest, head person, youngest girl in the school, oldest teacher in the school, together with a 5th agent who's completely anonymous, who works for the bank, so you don't know who they are, you can spend $100. Provided you record why and what. And then we can see what's working, and the rest of the money can follow what actually works, rather than people who are good at applying for grants. Now, we're really excited by this. That's what I'm going on to work on in Germany next week, because it allows you to allocate small amounts of money to highly local projects which bring together people who would normally disagree with each other so that you create empathy between them, and that's an example of working at scale. You don't talk about the problem, you change the interactions at scale, and the anonymity means you've got auditability. If you haven't got auditability, grant givers won't give everything. So it's a more effective technique as well. Now that's the adjacent possible. You're saying where people are at the moment is they know there's this problem. You can't take them to anybody can spend whatever money, so you move them to the adjacent possible. Well, if people can assemble these groups, and one of them is one of your agents who can decide whether it's okay or not, that's a safe adjacent possible. You can shift them there, then you can shift them again.
We have time for one short, maybe we take one
more, okay.
more question. If there is, if not, then do you want to comment, Nora?
Okay.
Very briefly, and then if you would.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think the way that I would respond to that is very similar but totally different. That there's a question of where that possible is sitting. And the danger that I think is what you're pointing to, which is that the habituated way of thinking, you're sitting on a board of directors and something comes up and everybody's used to aligning toward a particular notion of practicality, a particular notion of logical and actually authorizable behavior. Now, the problem is that the logical, practical, authorizable behavior is the behavior and the form of actions that has kept us in the systems that are perpetuating the systemic problems. So this is an issue, right, of how do you get like a board of directors out of the box. And so what I have found in that space is that it's necessary to begin to look at lots of other contexts. So this is what the Warm Data Lab is all about, is actually looking at a question that is not the question you think you're asking, and to look at it from lots of contextual places and start to generate stories. Now, what I see happening is that there is this is sort of something like a compost pile, and it fertilizes possibilities that are completely out of the perception of the group to begin with. They are not even remotely perceived on topic. So that's the sort of place where we are generating that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, Nora and I have cross-changed our staff between the two methods. There's a lot of interesting synthesis there. I think one point, if you really want to be a change agent, go and study retroviruses. Retroviruses are really interesting. They corrupt the DNA of the host. And that's what you've got to do. So if you're working in a large organization with corporate politics, you're not going to overcome that by telling them they're wrong. So they're all focused on outcome-based targets.
Or telling them that they're right.
Yeah, well, that's even worse. I'm taking it granted.
Can't tell them that either.
I don't think I've ever told anybody they were right. It's against my principles.
Why does that not surprise you?
Yeah. Some of them are closer to the truth than others, all right? And when we first met, we agreed we disliked all the same people.
Yes.
And that was the bonding moment, all right? So,
then we knew we were friends.
yeah, when we got to Meg Weekly, we knew we were there, all right? So that was the way it worked. But one thing you can say for executive, for example, is outcome-based targets produce perverse incentives. Everybody at executive knows that at the moment. They just don't know alternatives. So why don't we introduce vector-based targets when it's complex? Because vectors measure speed and direction of travel for energy use. So you don't say abandon targets. You say, well, maybe we should use this type of target here and that type of target there. So that's the adjacent possible concept. You've got to start with where people are if you want to change them. You've got to stop telling people where you think they should be. Right? And that's where the adjacent possible comes in. And that's one of the things we do. Nora does it in Warm Data Labs. We do it with SenseMaker software. We map where the adjacent possibles are at a fractal level in organizations. And then you ask this really simple change question. How do you create more stories like these and fewer stories like that? That is a whole new theory of change, because that can engage anybody regardless of their level of education. How do we create more stories like this and fewer stories like that?
Thank you. Nora, would you like to, we are coming to an end to this discussion. Thank you. Would you like to share one of your poems as a final word, and then otherwise I thank you already now for the discussion. And
do we have 50 seconds left? Is that
48,
we'll go
47, it's going down, all right? I can see it there.
Well, I'll tell you what
1.3 speed, all right?
I want to do. I want to actually read two, because I know we're out of time, but it doesn't matter. 185. And one of them is called Kinky. And I think this one ties nicely into what we've been saying. And then I want to read you another one that kind of comes back to like, why? Why is this important? But for now, kinky. When you see the clarity of a future horizon, turn quietly into the thick bush. The more elegant response is the one that wiggles, slipping from grasping anxiety, avoiding clean edges. Time brings a way through the impossible, but it oozes, slimy, entranced by the twisty, sticky, unwieldy bits, the tangents, the detours, the curly pockets of crud and life. The clear path is in itself a warning. Trimmed and tucked by Procrustean impulses of industrial habit. Instead, find the vital tangle of broken lines and crags, a fest of possibility in the festering, societies of ideas decomposing. Stinky belly buttons have more to offer the scouts now than 1,000 articles of strategic analysis. Weird dreams, untidied, sing the airy maps so they will not be found by the ones looking for management. And numbers will mock their lovers. Memories are rioting against reason. The future won't fit into the fear of rotting. It is the green stuff itself. The future is kinkier than we thought. So I hope you can take that with you, because it is important to keep a sense of humor and to keep an eye out for those beautiful, weird moments that open the adjacent possible. And the reason is that the stakes are high. It matters a lot. This is a piece that I wrote for my kids. And if any of you have kids, or you have nieces or nephews, or you have godchildren or grandchildren, or maybe you once were children, you might relate to this. It's called Mama Now, but it could be Papa Now, or Godmother Now, or Auntie Now, or Uncle Now, or whatever. Yeah. I wrote this for my kids about what it's like to be a parent in this moment. Your eyes will see the derailing of assumptions. Your hands will hold the crumble of the old matrix. I do not have any authority to lean into. I have empty pockets where parents used to advise their children. I do not have any maps, myths, or mother wisdom for you. I can fix your breakfast, but not the culture. And when you ask how to be a good person, I cannot lie to you. Everything you touch in a day is in some way bloodied. You have been born into an edgeless violence. But I will not judge or measure you against a bygone metric. I'm here, too, ready to learn with you. Unsure how to be or who to be. I can only read fragments of your worry, as the future is a horizon of confusion. I cannot protect you, and yet it is my only job. Aching as I witnessed from this side of the hourglass, other generations of parents knew the outlines: school, career, family, and retirement. But your life will be another shape entirely, forming in the fractures. When you say you need a goal, I offer you an expired ticket. Superficial memes roll off the tongue right into your bullshit detector. Success in the existing system is not going to do you much good. Your integrity is your rage, and I will nourish it. Your dignity is your curiosity, and I am tiny beside it. Your courage is your pain, and I will sing to it with you. We will riot together. We will notice the nuance of small grace in the day. We will wash the grit of loss for each other. I am your mama, and your future is the story of a storm. I am your cabin, your boots, your rucksack. Thank you.